Welcome back, everybody, to the Assertive Podcast. I'm Erica,
I'm Jess.
and we are licensed professional counselors in Texas, reviewing Am I the Asshole Reddit threads to help you learn skills for communication, healthy boundary setting, and assertive interpersonal functioning. After a week off, we are back to talk about addiction this week. Our first post today is Am I the Asshole for hiding a nicotine relapse from my girlfriend? I'm 22. My girlfriend, who's 21, have been living together for about 3 months. About a month after she moved in, I managed to quit smoking. She would constantly talk about how proud she was that I managed to kick the habit after 6 years, but she would just as frequently mention how disappointed she would be in me if I ever relapsed. There's only one small problem. A month and a half ago, life got ridiculously stressful, and because I always use nicotine as a coping mechanism for stress, I ended up picking up the vape again. I've always been extremely cautious about having it again. I know it doesn't leave the same smell that a cigarette does, but I've done my best to keep them hidden when she's home, and I've made a rule not to touch it when both of us are home. The only time she saw it was about 2 weeks ago. And when I heard her ask, "What was that?" in a clearly upset tone, I said, "Oh, a coworker was asking me to hold on to it for him." But I was panicked. Since then, part of me has felt like I should just own up to her and face the music, but the other part of me feels like I'm better off not saying anything until I manage to actually quit again. I know it's wrong of me to keep secrets like this, but I worry I may end up homeless if I were to own up to it, since she would likely just move back in with her mother, and I would have no option once the apartment we share gets too expensive for me alone. So, am I the asshole?
Okay, as you're reading this, I'm looking at the timeline. They lived
Yeah,
together.
I did that. Yes,
I think
I
he
did
only
that
quit
in real time.
because I think he basically is like he only quit for 2 weeks. I think is what's happened. They moved together. It's been 3 months. A month after she moved in, after they moved together, he quit.
Okay.
And so
2 months
then
ago, he quit,
and then
basically.
6 weeks ago, a month and a half ago, he relapsed. So he only quit for 2 weeks, I think. Is that right? Is that mathing?
That's mathing.
Okay, so yeah,
I
anybody
don't
can
think he
quit.
quit.
Staying quit is the issue here. You did not quit. You had a period of detox or something like that. But yeah. Also, how hilarious is to be like, oh, I'm holding this vape for a friend. It's like he can buy it at a gas station. It's legal, and we're all adults, but that's fine. We get some like cocaine or something. I'm just holding it for a friend.
Mm-hmm.
Man, what are your first impressions of this? What an interesting situation.
Oh
boy.
First impressions is, I think this is a great example, and because it's nicotine, it maybe feels less heavy than if we were talking about other substances or behaviors. But this is classic addiction, right? We have the minimizing, we have the lying, we have the lies being built to cover up other lies. We have unrealistic expectations that we're setting for ourselves, unrealistic expectations other people have of us. We have high risk situations, right? Even if the lie was like we're holding the vape for a friend, but if you are newly quit, 3 months quitting, you should not be holding your DOC, drug of choice is what that stands for, your DOC or its components.
Right.
For other people, that's high risk. That's a no-no.
Yeah, and even he got into like a really like kind of stressful situation, and like that was I think really high risk also, where maybe he probably didn't have a plan going into
high risk
that.
Emotions, yep.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? So if the girlfriend bought the lie of like holding it for a friend, you'd be like, why in the fuck would you do that, right? Like that's almost more of like a damning lie than just saying I bought it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But that was my first impression, was like so many of the various components that go into addiction that I think people just are unaware of.
Totally.
Like, here it is, all laid out in this 3-paragraph post.
That's and it feels kind of innocent, right? But like it, maybe if this person was addicted to like opioids, maybe you could understand how the girlfriend would say, "Hey, if you relapse, I'm done, maybe." But to say you're gonna be homeless because you bought a vape, that might be a little bit forest for the trees there. We all have our limits, our deal breakers, but wow, that's pretty intense there.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're like the token kind of addiction qualities. I think you're right about that here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so if he's 22 and has been using a vape for 6 years, he got into this pretty young. So he's never, 16. So he's never really been kind of an online functioning person without nicotine before. So that'll be a big uphill thing for him.
Especially as he's probably entering early adulthood at 22. If you're in college, you're usually getting ready to graduate or graduating in the next few years, and you're really going to have to, for real adults, you're not living in a campus dorm or with your parents. You're living on your own. So this may be his first independent living situation. So on top of just like real world stress, like now I have like a big boy job. You have big boy bills to go along with that big boy job.
Yeah, you got like a shared space. You got like a serious girlfriend that you're living with. Yeah. So I think like more of a I'm going to use the term old school. That might be a misnomer, but kind of like a more old school approach to addiction used to be like an abstinence model, where the only way of doing it well is to not do it at all. And so I think that's where like 12-step is really popular in that framework, which works for some people. I think that's a space for that also. What's your now they're moving towards what's called a harm reduction approach. I think it's actually like the national standard of addiction recovery is harm reduction, which is this is a crude example. I tell clients this, like if you used to shoot up heroin and now you smoke weed, that's success, right? You're not sober, quote unquote, but like we would way rather take that in terms of like the amount of damage that you can do to yourself.
And the risk for harm. Yeah,
risk for harm, right? It's like when you're talking to clients about lifelong kind of wellness in the framework of substance use, do you kind of lean towards one model or maybe not either one of those?
I think it really depends on what it is, but typically I will do harm reduction if they've gone through like a full program, and let's say they did like inpatient, residential, PHP, outpatient, and they've had a period of abstinence. I'm going to encourage them to obviously sustain that.
Okay.
And we're not going to like reintroduce it or introduce other substances when we've detoxed our body.
Okay.
But if they're coming in an outpatient level and we're trying to tackle it outpatient, I think harm reduction is the way I typically will go with that. There are obviously going to be exceptions, but
yeah, that's fair. So if they've had a really kind of severe bottom, they've gone totally sober and they're maintaining that, you're not going to say, hey, let's like go
let's smoke weed instead of like
see what
up.
happens. Yeah. Okay. So it depends on kind of their severity and kind of what's worked for them so far and how you would do that. Yeah, that's fair. I think I tell clients too, I think it depends on the substance. Like I'm sure they exist. I've never met like a recreational occasional meth user. Just haven't had that happen before. Again, I'm sure there is a spot. So, or even to say that maybe somebody's drug of choice, is Xanax. I don't, is it really beneficial to figure out how to use Xanax recreationally? I'm not sure. So I think also it kind of depends too on like the cost benefit.
Yeah.
And so I think, or maybe somebody really uses cocaine super impulsively, but they can drink sporadically, so I might even pick some substances to have an abstinent model versus a harm reduction model, depending on the relationship with it. Yeah.
I think the abstinence model is maybe so popular is because of every substance usually lowers your inhibition. So if, we can drink in moderation, but we tend to use cocaine aggressively. Okay. But then what happens when I'm shit-faced drunk and somebody's offering me cocaine? Chances are I'm going to take that.
Oh, for sure.
So using alcohol automatically puts you into a high-risk situation. And so that's typically why people will stress the abstinence all the way around, like complete sobriety.
Yeah. I think I tell clients, like, you got to be really honest. I get that you would love to be a social drinker, but if every time you do, you use cocaine, probably not going to be able to have a recreational relationship with alcohol. And I
Yeah.
think you got to just really be honest about your patterns and like what's realistic,
Mm-hmm.
in that situation there. Yeah. And I think one thing I do appreciate about the harm reduction is I think what is considered success is very broad.
Rod.
Like
Mm-hmm.
if you are, and which I think maybe also is, talk about like statistically, like, oh, well, harm reduction is so successful. I'm like, well, yeah, look at what is success. Everything but dying is success, right? Where abstinence, it's like, unless you are totally sober, you are failing. And so I think what happens a lot with clients who come in like a 12-step program is that they want to move to a harm reduction. There's this process of like kind of unwiring your brain a little bit, that like there is a state of moderation, because a 12-step will teach you, well, if you do this one more time, you're going to just be an animal and just use until you're dead. And I think that can also create some kind of complicated relationships too for people who've gotten in recovery in a 12-step model to move to a harm reduction.
Yeah.
It makes that relationship really extreme sometimes. And so I think when we could tell a client of like, hey, you don't have to be like relapsing or sober, you could have a middle ground. I think that feels like sustainable, because I think the amount of like lifelong sobriety that happens from 12-step is pretty rare. But if you're able to fit in a harm reduction, that can be a lifelong sustainable model, because what is successful is so broad. So, statistical grain of salt there, but I can see the benefits to both sides.
Yeah.
The story. And then 12-step is also therapeutic. So there's a lot of other benefits of being in a program too, aside just from sobriety,
Yeah.
What do you think? So this guy, he recognizes that he's had a problem with vaping for a long time. Something motivated him to want to stop. We talk about like stages of change with clients and meeting them where they're at. How do you, do you do psychoeducation about stages of change, or what are your thoughts on that?
Sometimes I do. I was trying to think how often I really did this, even in groups. I don't. Maybe once every blue moon, I would break out and we would do stages of change. If most of the group was in action stage, and then we had this like pre-contemplative or contemplative person come in and they're like really ruffling the feathers, I take a day and I kind of explain the stages of change and why this maybe feels abrasive for them, or why this is really hard for the new person coming in.
Oh, so did it to kind of explain kind of behaviors, so like why this person is struggling in this program or whatever.
You guys all went through this.
Yeah.
But yeah. So for you guys out there, we have 5 stages of change. I haven't done this in a really long time, so I'm gonna hope I get this right, because I did not prep for this.
I got it in my noggin. I got your back. I got your back.
Right. We start with pre-contemplative. This is a person who's not willing to admit that they have a problem. This is essentially denial. Then we go into contemplative. They're maybe willing to consider that they have a problem, not really ready to take any steps. Preparation, which is now we're looking into what would change look like and what would it take to change, but we're not actually taking any change. Then we have action. This is where we're actively making moves to engage in the changed behavior. And then we have maintenance.
Okay. Where is that? Action for 6 months? Is that what we consider maintenance?
Yeah. We've engaged in the changed behavior for 6+ months.
And that's what I think where we use the word quit. I would not use the word quit. Stage of change. He's using the word quit like a week in, that he's quit. Which I think it's good to like commit to that and to like change how you're talking about that. But I think he's got himself in a hole here now, because now he's viewing this as like a failure and things like that.
Yeah.
So when somebody's in, well, really, so at any point in those stages of change is the opportunity for like a relapse or some kind of lapse. Do you differentiate between like a relapse and a lapse? Because in like a 12-step, that's super taboo. They would say it's all or nothing. So there is no differentiation. But in a harm reduction model, you generally would have some kind of distinguishing feature there.
I think using the distinguishing feature gives people a little bit of compassion, grace, and lets them keep some of their dignity.
Yeah.
Whereas if you say a lapse is a one-time slip,
Okay.
right? I went to this party, I drank, but I woke up the next day. I realized what I had done. I called my sponsor. I went to a meeting and I recommitted to sobriety. I would consider that a lapse. And then we continued doing the next right thing.
Okay, like a little oopsie.
Little
Let me get back on the wagon. Oopsie. Did a little cocaine, oopsie daisies.
I don't know if you watched Schitt's Creek, but there's this episode where like David pees the bed from like nerves and like anxiety and like stress.
This is an adult?
And they call it like a little oopsie daisy. So when you said that, all I could think about was like peeing the bed.
I mean, if you drink enough, sometimes those things happen. Well, oopsie daisy. Yeah, for a lot of reasons. So it means like, I like the idea of like the proverbial like peeing the bed just means like you just kind of fucked up one night, huh? I really pissed the bed last night, you guys. We're gonna make it to a saying. Let's start it.
Yeah. I mean, it's better than screwed the pooch. I don't know where that came from.
I really pissed the bed last night. What? Oh, I want to use that in the next week. I'm giving myself a personal commitment to just blend that into my common vernacular.
You should use it with a client and see what they do.
Like, you really pissed the bed there, didn't you? They'd probably be like, yeah, I definitely did. I feel like I probably say weird shit like that all the time in session. What? Oh, man.
Oh, God. But yes, a lapse is more of just like a oopsie daisy, small little slip. Relapse is where we had our slip and we didn't get back on track. We stayed off track. Okay. And so that's essentially what happened for this kid, where he had a stressful day, smoked, and then kept smoking. It's not like he smoked that one day and when stress became manageable, he managed it. His life did eventually become manageable, but he continued to smoke.
So that's like he picked up like a pattern of engaging in that. Yeah. So he's past the lapse at this point because he always like when I was would like buy a vape and is hiding it. So that's more than one episode of use. Right? Yeah.
He's trying to do some boundaries, and I can maybe see that as part of like a harm reduction model where I'm not smoking around her. I think boundaries would be if we were doing it out of respect and she was aware that we were doing it. It's not a boundary if you're hiding this from her. This is a secret. So I want to make that clear. Like,
that's a good point.
I think he's trying to set limitations with himself, but the limitations are to feed the addiction. And when we talked about values, I want to say when we did Joy Part 2, we talked about if you are engaged in active addiction processes, everything you do is going to be geared toward meeting the needs of the addiction.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing here. It's not, I'm not smoking around her because I know she doesn't like to see me smoking and she hates the smell. It's no, I'm not doing it around her because I don't want to get caught.
Yeah, and he's saying I would rather smoke this vape than have a home. He's saying the risk of smoking this vape is homelessness, which to the outside person is insane, but that's how strong addiction is, right? When you think about the propulsion of it,
and it lies to you. It's like, oh, you can totally get away with this.
Yeah, no one's gonna know. It's like, like one time, or this is the last time that you won't eat it anymore. There's all kinds of lies that tells you.
Yeah.
And I talked about like one of the things with addiction being like building lies on lies. And I think that's why people really get frustrated with people struggling with addiction, because I think that addiction demands that they are dishonest. But I think most people, I think it's hard to find somebody who doesn't love somebody who's addicted to something. Most of us know or love somebody who has some kind of addiction problem. Like that person isn't a bad person. They're not like a liar by default or sneaky or shady by default. But when the addiction comes in, they'll compromise their character to feed that need. And I think that can be really frustrating for the loved ones to deal with that.
Absolutely. I don't know if you said this a lot with your groups. I said it a lot with mine. Addiction lives in secrecy. It lives in the darkness.
Oh, yeah.
It hates the light. It hates honesty. because it has nowhere to go and it has to be confronted and you have to challenge your behaviors.
Which when you're in a pre-contemplative or preparation stage of change, you might not be ready for that confrontation. So the lies are meeting you at your stage of change there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I heard someone, which I think is so true. I hadn't thought about it in this way until I heard that. They said the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And I think that's so true because I think addiction requires like isolation and privacy and secrecy. And I think that really it's like a social need or like a void that we're like missing. And I think that's why I think even 12 steps or other recovery groups are so powerful, because you have like a community where I think when like this person's, you know, trying to quit in a vacuum, but like there's no really support system here. They're not talking about cravings with anybody. They're really isolating and being sneaky. And that's just addiction fuel.
Yeah. And also it makes everything feel shameful. Like the urges and the cravings and the fact that you had a stressful day and you wanted to smoke. If you had a group of like-minded folks like, oh yeah, absolutely, been there.
So normal, right?
And they just normalize that experience for you. And then you don't feel so insane.
Yeah, that's so true. This isn't something I learned about till I was like a therapist, but I was, you know, I had quite a extensive education about addiction before that, you know, even with the diagnostic criteria for addiction, one of them is experiencing cravings. That symptom can persist years and years and years after sobriety or abstinence. And so cravings isn't actually a marker of active addiction. And so if you are somebody in recovery, you should expect that you will have cravings. They are absolutely normal and they will absolutely happen. And that does not mean that you are not working a program or doing your shit, you know, but that is something that you might struggle with for the rest of your life, is like craving that thing.
Yeah.
And those nicotinic receptors, especially, they take a long time to get trimmed away from the brain. Those are really persistent. It's like our brain has a specific receptor only for nicotine, which there's no other substances that it's like that, but it has one for nicotine. And so it's really hard to quit. So you can't do it alone, you know, and this guy's being really secretive. We can turn this out. I didn't realize this author is a female. This is a lesbian couple.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, you're right. Damn.
I was like, oh, not that it matters. We'll just say he because we've been doing it. I was like, oh shit. It's not a that.
Yeah, I didn't notice that either. Also makes me wonder how long they've been together. I thought about this originally, but especially because I know lesbian couples tend to like move on like really quickly.
So quick. You have to say, well, how do you know lesbian couples on the second date?
They're living together?
Are you all in the driveway? Yeah. It's like a joke. Me and Wilson used to joke about that all the time. Yeah.
But yeah.
And so, I mean, given that, you know, I think it's even really taboo, depending on the model of addiction, where they say relapse is normal. You know, and an abstinence, they would say, absolutely not. That means you're not doing your program. That's preventable. But a harm reduction, they say it's a normal part of recovery. Which is hard for people who love somebody who's in addiction to be able to tolerate a lapse or even a full-blown relapse. In terms of establishing realistic expectations for loved ones, how do you kind of talk maybe like a family member or a loved one through supporting that person?
I think having realistic expectations for what your loved one is capable of and setting realistic boundaries. And so I think this is where maybe that differentiation between a lapse and a relapse could be helpful. Because if you lapse and then you own up to it and we get you back on the wagon, that's okay. I can tolerate that. You're working within my frame of boundaries. If you relapse and you're actively in your addiction, lying and hiding things, you're functioning outside the realm of my boundaries, and now some consequences are going to have to take place. And so I think those are realistic. I think it's realistic to think that somebody would have a lapse. And I think it's realistic to ask them to be honest about it. It's going to maybe stretch them out of their comfort zone to own up to that.
Yeah.
That's on them to do if they are in that action or preparation phase of change. That they need to stretch their comfort zone a little bit and own up to that. And that to me is going to show, okay, you're willing to do this. You're committed to this. I'm going to support you. And this is what it's going to look like from here. Some additional things may happen. We're going to figure out like what went wrong. How do we prevent that in the future? How can we put more support in this particular place?
Hmm.
But I think making sure everybody's expectations are realistic, and that's going to depend on the independent person, probably their substance that they're addicted to.
Yeah.
That's also going to play probably a big part. Yeah. And their willingness to admit when they fell off the wagon or fucked up. Piss the bed.
Yeah. Yes, you used it so often. Just rolls off the tongue, that one. I love that. Yeah. And I think it's really hard when you love somebody who's in addiction, when they tell you that they've lapsed, to not react out of like fear or anger, or and if you're reacting in a judgmental or really intense way, that person might not feel comfortable continuing to express their perceived failures to you. And so that is scary for the family members, and it is frustrating. And the best thing you can do is to say, like, I really appreciate you telling me what's your plan today to have this not happen again tomorrow, and just acknowledge that it happened. You don't have to shame them and all that. Just, you're going to move on, because them telling you is already going to be challenging enough, because they know they're going to be disappointed. So like you want to like honor that vulnerability, and that they're behaving normally for a person with addiction. People with addiction act in addiction. To be sober is the unnatural state for them to be in. So like, gotta acknowledge like it's difficult, and they're doing their best.
Yeah. And you said something I think important there with respecting their vulnerability. They know you're disappointed. You don't have to tell them.
Absolutely, they know. Yeah, they definitely know.
They know what look you're going to have on your face. They know it all. They know what you're going to say. They know what you're thinking. Yeah. So if you surprise them and just say, I appreciate you telling me, what's our next step? Where do we go from here?
Yeah.
You'll probably actually catch them off guard and be like, oh shit, I didn't think we would be having this conversation. I thought I'd be packing my bags to leave.
Right. And then talk about like, willingness for next time. And like, so like, that's you celebrating growth. You're not, shaming a slip, because if we want progress and like not perfection, that it takes, being sober is hard. It takes practice, and it takes a while, and it doesn't always go perfectly. So to know that your partner, I think that in the difficult thing, I don't know if you've heard this. I hear this addiction compared a lot to like diabetes. They say, well, you wouldn't be mad at somebody for being diabetic, right? Like, it's a medical condition. They don't have control over it. And I say, my thing to that is, yes, I believe addiction is a disease under like the medical model. And also, once you know you're diabetic, it's up to you to manage your illness. So if you know you're diabetic and you're going to go eat chocolate cake and orange juice, and then say, well, it's not my fault because I have an addiction, I think that's bullshit too. So I think there is accountability within the medical model. But when somebody admits to relapse and you're shaming them, you're making that very personal. You're like taking away the kind of biological component of that and making it about their character, which they don't want to have that issue either. Of course not. So they can't, there's things that they cannot help, right, if they're wired that way. But there's some things that are the responsibility, that they know that this is what they have to manage it. So there is that balance there between like grace and accountability. But I think that's really hard for the family to not freak out whenever there's a lapse, or to feel really disappointed.
I think that's why it's really important that everybody has some sort of support, whether you're doing like family or relationship counseling, or you just have your own individual counselor if you are engaged in a relationship, whether that's family or romantic or friendship, who's in addiction, because you can go to that space and like freak the fuck out. Yeah. And that's your space to do that. And you can say, I'm so terrified. And then you get to kind of put on that strong front and say, what do we do from here? Let's tackle this. Let's do the next thing. So you're not having to like stuff what you're feeling and stuff those fears. You do have a space for those, but that space is not with them. It's like if you had your kid in treatment and they had cancer, doctor's not going to tell you the worst news in front of your kid, because they know you're going to freak out. They're going to take you somewhere privately, let you get adjusted to that, and then they take you in.
That's a really good point. Yeah, not saying, you're going to be scared, right? You're going to be frustrated, disappointed. Have those feelings and talk about them. Just it's not going to be effective to do that with the person with the addiction. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So with this, if they say the author was your client, they came in, they're processing this relapse and the nicotine
Mm-hmm.
addiction, how would you kind of like walk them through like this relapse and
Mm-hmm.
process all of that?
Yeah. When we did groups, we did what is called a relapse autopsy. So we basically just figure out what is the cause of death of your sobriety, basically. We would do it in like the CBT format. And so we look at what were your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors before the relapse, during the relapse, and then after the relapse. And then we go back and look at where is there potential for change. Typically, it's in the before. There were probably some high risk things we needed to do or coping skills we didn't utilize that we should have. Sometimes it's in the during, right? Like, oh, I like lit my cigarette. I probably should have just put it out. Like, even though I lit it, I still could have probably set it down. You're right. You could have. That would have taken a lot of self control at that point.
Yeah.
But you could have. That's a good point.
Mhm.
And then, like, afterwards, well, I didn't need to go buy a vape. That's a great point. You didn't need to do that.
And then here we are, piss in the bed.
So then we can kind of see, like, where are our points of intervention?
Yes.
What in this is preventable? What do we kind of set ourselves up for and do some self-sabotaging? And if we were ever in this situation again, what would we do differently once we're kind of in it? So the during and the after, what are we going to do differently?
And I love using that, like mulligans. You've got to do over. What would you do differently? Because that's like that's like them teaching themselves how to solve problems, and I love that approach.
And for this kid, I mean, I say kid, they're what, 21, 22?
We're so fucking old now. We're like, oh, these already kids in their college years.
You know what? Your brain is not fully developed, so you're still a kid.
Yes,
that is my rationale.
Yeah.
So I don't think they had coping skills other than smoking. And they're saying, I always use nicotine as a coping mechanism for stress. Before you quit, you should have already had new coping skills in place. That's like, I work from home and I cut my internet off and I didn't schedule to overlap my internet coverage. So now I'm going 3 days without internet and I can't work and I'm losing money and I'm in trouble at work.
Yeah.
You need to have your coping skills in place.
Right.
And then we can cut it off. With nicotine, other things we may need to just kind of go cold turkey for doing opioids or something like.
We'll figure it out later, huh? Just like you can't. Yeah. So I'm like, you can't change a tire, or I don't know
while you're driving.
Or like, you can't learn to swim while you're drowning. You know, like you can't learn skills when you're not in a space to be able to learn skills. I call it a sufficient substitute. I'm like, whatever the nicotine or substance X is doing for you, we have to identify the primary and secondary benefits. Now we got to find some other things that meet that need, because if we're just making a void, of course you're going to go back. That needs unmet. You got to have these substitution behaviors. And if you're living in a vacuum and not under the guidance of like a therapist or recovery person, you're not going to fucking know that or what that looks like, you know? So the relapse autopsy, so you do the thoughts, feelings, behaviors before, during, and after, and that helps the client kind of think through the lead up, where they had those moments to do something differently. And so then you have them identify like kind of the stopping points and other actions they could have taken.
Often in early recovery or early treatment, they have a lot of what we call like automatic thought processes. Where we're just so used to doing things, we're not aware that that's what we're thinking or doing. And so the autopsy goes back and makes them like actually replay that tape. And we're like, hit pause there. What's happening? What are you thinking? It's like, oh, I didn't realize I thought that. Like, okay, so we need to be more aware of what we're thinking and catch that and flag that as a high risk thought. Let's push play again. Let's go through. What were we feeling here? It's feeling really stressed out. Everything seemed unmanageable. Okay, we're going to flag that in our brain. That's a high risk feeling for us. Yeah.
It's like wisdom, huh? Like learning from your experiences, like inserting that. Yeah. And so with this if the author was your client, you would do a kind of relapse autopsy, like, hey, let's break down. You're sober for a whole 2 weeks from nicotine, and then by the way, I don't know that I don't think that I would have categorized that as actual abstinence at that point. So I don't know if it's
No.
even actually a lapse or a relapse, because I don't think that they ever really maintained any kind of abstinence. But well, I don't know if you did it for
I think
6
it was a
years,
test
2
run.
weeks.
I think it
It's
was
a
a good
test
test run.
Yeah, and that's
It's
why
a
I
good
think
test run, and we learned some data. We learned what is going to catch us up or
yeah.
trip us up.
Yeah.
But yeah, I kind of agree with that. 2 weeks it's a good trial. You did like your trial subscription there to sobriety.
You wouldn't say you were like a member of Spotify, you know, because you did a little trial there. You say you test them out to see if you wanted to commit to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would, you know, I think it'd be difficult, but I definitely encourage this person to talk to their partner about the lapse.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or I mean, it's a full blown relapse. How would
Mhm.
you made this face like, oh, hell, gee. Yeah. How would you coach
Absolutely.
them on that conversation?
I would probably just pull out our old communication skills of throwing in some I statements.
Mm-hmm.
I think an apology is appropriate because we're breaching some of the trust within the relationship by lying.
Yeah.
So I think an apology here would be appropriate to make for lying. Maybe not necessarily, I'm sorry for relapsing. That seems a bit maybe over the top with
Well,
my
that's
knowledge of
wrong.
addiction. Yeah.
Yeah, you say it's not your fault, right? Like, you didn't choose to be a person with addiction. That's not what you wanted to have happen. Yeah.
But yeah, I would pull up the I statements and I feel and I'm sorry that I lied to you and this is what happened and this is what I'm doing to be back on track.
Mm-hmm.
I was afraid to tell you because I couldn't live on my own and I thought you would leave me.
Yeah.
So,
I like that.
and then I think that could naturally progress into what is supportive. Maybe even throwing in some validation of how the partner feels. Like, I understand why this would be upsetting and why you would want to leave. And that makes a lot of sense to me. That's not abnormal. But yeah, and even talking about like what support looks like and what addiction looks like and saying, hey, I got these resources from my therapist you might be interested in reading, or here's some Al-Anon groups that you might be interested in joining to get more education and what that's like.
Yeah.
For partners, somebody who's probably quitting smoking, they're probably not going to go through all of that, I would imagine.
Probably not. Not for smoking. Yeah.
But for other substances, I think they might be more interested in kind of gaining that education and finding support of other folks who are dealing with somebody who is in addiction and recovery.
Yeah. And Niconon is a 12-step program for people recovering from nicotine. It's a thing. So I'm sure they have some kind of
know that.
Yeah, there's all kinds of, if there's a substance, there's a 12-step program. Yeah, Niconon is, if you guys need any resources, that's for smoking cessation. So with that, you would when he says, I don't know if I should tell her until I'm ready to quit again, because we coach on this podcast, we don't want to apologize if we're not going to change behavior.
You're right. I didn't even catch that line.
Yeah. So would you would you encourage him to talk about it before he's ready to change? He's kind of in like he's vacillating between like preparation, contemplation, and action.
Mm-hmm.
He's kind of swirling around.
So the actual line is, I'm better off, a part of me feels I'm better off not saying anything until I manage to actually quit again.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that means he's not ready to quit. To me, that word has a bit of a different connotation to it. Mm-hmm. So if we're not ready to quit, I wouldn't do the apology. I would still own up to it.
Okay.
If they are actively trying to quit and maybe they are doing a harm reduction model, like I'm only hitting my vape 2 times a day and I was hitting it like 6 times a day.
Okay.
Right. Like, okay, we're seeing some reduction here. There's progress. I'm going to go ahead and encourage them to give that apology because they are making steps to change. And I think the expectations of what that change looks like are just going to be communicated within that.
That's fair. So if he's
and that can be owned up too. Like, I had this expectation that I could just quit and quit forever and that I would never relapse. And that wasn't realistic for me to have for myself. So it wasn't realistic for me to communicate that to you, to have that expectation on me either.
Yes.
And so I've gotten some education. And this is what my therapist has explained to me. This is what we can expect. This is the standard I'm holding for myself. This is the timeline I've worked on. This is the expectation that I want to be held accountable with you on. Is this week I'm 2 times a week. Next week I'm 1 time. And after that, my goal is not to do it.
Okay.
But I still might every blue moon. But my goal would be to not to do it. After like 4 months, I'm getting rid of my vape.
So once the author would know what's realistic to expect of himself, then he could talk to his partner, his girlfriend, about, hey, this is not maybe what you had hoped it would look like in terms of like total abstinence, but I'm moving in this other direction, and these are the steps that I'm taking.
Mm-hmm. And now I'm not doing it alone, so hopefully I'll be more successful.
Yeah. I was thinking through, I think I've only met one person in my life where once they decided to stop an addiction, they never did it again. And I've met maybe close to thousands of people at this point, right? But like active, at least hundreds of people who have like gotten into some kind of help because of addiction. And his name is Mark. He's very old. He's been sober for fucking 4 decades or something like that. He's the only person I've ever met who just decided never did it again. So to think that you're not gonna have a relapse, you're kind of being a fool a little bit. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
I mean,
I was gonna say, I have one client. They got sober 2021. Still sober per their report, obviously. So 3 years of sobriety, almost 3.5, I think, at this point.
Oh yeah, people have had like dozens of years of sobriety and relapsed. I think Mark is what I know. He's probably in his 70s, and he decided when he was 20 or 30, I think, to stop. But which is crazy.
Well, I know for my client, I can't say if this is true for Mark or other folks. One thing for my client is they were medicating undiagnosed mental health stuff.
Oh yeah.
And so once they decided to medicate and address the mental health stuff, like that external need to do it left, and it was really just dealing with like the addictive parts of the brain and changing the habits.
That's made me think of a whole other thing that's going on there, right? Of like, what are the benefits that this person's getting from that? Like, are they treating something for them? Like, nicotine, I don't know that would really mask mental health issues, but maybe he's smoking with other people. Maybe it's social. Maybe there could be other things that are going on. That it's not just about the nicotine, but there's something else that's happening there. Yeah. So if the girlfriend was your client, what would you talk to her about in terms of supporting her partner?
I would probably have very similar conversations regarding expectations, doing some basic psychoeducation on addiction and addictive processes, the realities of recovery and living in recovery. And then I think for the partner, I would have an honest conversation about what you envision your relationship to be like. And is this something you want to take on? Again, we don't know how long they've been dating. But this is probably going to be something they struggle with, and you guys could live happily ever after. And in 20 years, a million things happen at once and they end up smoking again. Is that something you're going to be okay with? And you're going to stick by them and support them in that?
Yeah.
And start this process kind of over again.
Yeah.
Or is smoking going to be a deal breaker in your relationship? And if that's a deal breaker, this may not be the person for you.
That's a good point. Like, can you tolerate your person's the crosses they bear, basically?
Yeah. With a little bit of compassion and grace and supporting them through that. Because if you expect them to just get sober and stay sober for the eternity, you may be disappointed. And if that's going to create a big rift in your relationship, you need to consider a different relationship, or you need to do some work to tolerate that discomfort when it happens.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. And I would really, in terms of like, Al-Anon and some of the recovery things, it's all about like, if if their addiction is like ruining your life, you need to get your shit together. Like focus on yourself, have some hobbies. Like what is your self-care? Like if your whole wellness is about like focusing on this other person, like you're not being healthy in that relationship. So I think if the girlfriend was my client, I'd be like, okay, so he's smoking. Tell me what you did today for self-care. So I'd be focusing on that. I don't care that he's smoking. That doesn't change your day. Like you don't want that for your partner, but like it's his body and he's doing what he wants with it, and like you don't want to waste your mental energy controlling him. So what are you going to do to find peace?
Yeah. That's a good point.
So I kind of feel like he is an asshole, given medical model and all. What do you is he the asshole? What's your verdict here?
I think so too, because I think lying within the boundaries of a relationship is just not okay. That's not a healthy relationship. And I think pretending to be somebody you're not in the confines of a relationship is not healthy. And so I do think that makes him an asshole here for lying. I think had you just owned up to it, you wouldn't be an asshole. But you decided to live in secrecy.
I agree. So it's not the relapse that makes him an asshole, but it's the lying, deception.
The lying.
An asshole.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think the girlfriend. I get the impression like she's 21. She's young, or what I'd consider young.
Yeah.
I think that she is trying to be loving and trying to be supportive, and I think that maybe she also thinks that expressing her anticipatory disappointment is meant to be motivating. But I think it's not
backfiring. Yeah,
it's backfiring, right? So I don't think that she's being an asshole. I think that she's perhaps misguided on how to be supportive, and I think that she needs some support and guidance on like how to deal with that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
or maybe even saying I'd be disappointed if you relapse, but I hope you would tell me and I would still love you.
Yeah,
like you need to elongate that sentence, or you need to not say it at all.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, that's a good point. And I do think it's a side note funny. He's not like, oh, if she found out she would leave me, my heart would be broken. He'd be like, I don't know where I would live and rent a
I did notice that too.
I was like, oh, that is like a talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like your shelter
and shelter.
Yeah, but I thought that was so funny. Oh man.
Well, maybe it's not a threat to break up. Maybe that was just a condition of living together.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, that's
like fair. I don't want to live with a smoker. I don't want my shit to smell like smoke. Okay. So potentially that is not the boundary that she set, that they wouldn't be together. It's just I'm not living with a smoker.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay.
But yeah, I did notice that too and thought that was funny.
And this might be taboo to say, but I think this is true. If you're in a relationship and the person has an addiction and they're consistently lying to you, you need to check how you're reacting to them, because your reaction is probably encouraging them to lie, because you're probably reacting very poorly to their honesty, even when they're trying to be vulnerable. So that I don't want that to come off like victim blaming or anything like that. Like addictions happen. But if you're repeatedly finding these patterns of dishonesty, like look at yourself too, of like, why might this person not feel like they can come to me about these things? And have some ownership on that too, of like how you're responding to them having pissed the bed on occasion. So also too, like, I think it takes two to tango. And this is partly an addiction problem, but this is a relationship problem at the end of it. And both parties are contributing to this problem in this situation.
Yeah, you want to be a safe place for your partner to come with their problems. And if you're having a meltdown or freaking out on them, you're not a safe space.
Yeah, they're not going to want to bother you. They're not going to want to inflict that stress on you or invite that conflict. Yeah. And so if you saying, oh, if I'm honest about buying a vape, I'm going to leave you, why would they tell you that they bought a vape? They wouldn't. No motivation, So just, maybe look on that too for the girlfriend.
Yeah. This may get more into our financial boundaries, but I'd be very curious if the one solution is to just move out. Whose name is this apartment in? And you are approved for it by yourself. You should be able to pay for it by yourself.
That is, as a rule of thumb, if you have two incomes and you live as though you have one, you're going to be okay. This might have been learned out of being burned too many times, but that's fine. That's a good rule of thumb. Just live as though you have one income. And you'll never be overextended, you know? Ugh.
But yeah, if it's that easy for them to leave, we may not have set that up quite right.
I think so.
Otherwise, I couldn't imagine I would want to pay to break a lease if you had restarted smoking. Like, chances are the cost benefit analysis there is going to be, I'm just going to help you quit smoking again. Air quotes.
Air quotes. And even it's, which again, harm reduction, right? Cigarettes from a vape, like lesser of the evil. The longitudinal data we might find in 40 years that we find out the vapes have been causing cancer and are all for free. Who knows? But for the time being, we understand vapes to be a harm reduction model from like cigarettes. So again, in terms of nicotine addiction, this is about as low risk as you can get.
Mm-hmm.
I think the girlfriend needs to chill the fuck out a little bit, to be honest. I know it's frustrating. Not to blame her. Addiction's frustrating. I get that, but also chill the fuck out too.
And again, this is all because this is nicotine. If he was like smoking crack secretly, this would probably be very different.
Or yeah, and like the least harmful thing on the spectrum of harm reduction is
yeah. All right. Other thoughts?
I don't think so. I'll summarize for us here.
Yeah.
So we said there's a couple models of wellness within recovery. Some people like the abstinence model and more of like a 12-step approach. Harm reduction is becoming more popular, and I think is adopted as our kind of our national standard for recovery. Both have their strengths and weaknesses. We briefly introduced the stages of change, which are pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. It's important to be realistic about where you're at with that and where your partner might be at in terms of what you can expect. Lapses and relapses are normal, quote unquote, in recovery. A lapse would be a wetting the bed, a kind of oopsie daisy one-off. A relapse is resuming a pattern of use. We'd said if you do find yourself in a lapse or relapse, something that could be helpful is doing a relapse autopsy, where you're looking for the cause of death. So that's you examining your thoughts, feelings, and behavior before, during, and after the lapse. That will help you kind of identify maybe some thought errors that contributed to the lapse or opportunities for intervention. In terms of being supportive, we should expect that if we are with somebody who is in recovery, that they will probably have relapses and lapses. It's helpful to be patient with them. We want to encourage honesty and moving forward as opposed to shaming them for the lapse. Did I miss anything? That was like a really kind of high level review.
Mm-hmm. I think that covered most of it. Alrighty. Well, that's what we have for you guys on this one. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. You can send them to us via email, assertivepodcast@gmail.com, or find us on Instagram @assertivepodcast. Until next time.